Hello, welcome to Alpha Anywhere Q&A for July 13th, 2022. I'm Scott Allen. I'm filling in for Dave McCormick, who's on vacation at the moment, and I'm here with Sarah Mitchell, who's going to be giving us an amazing presentation today, as always, well, as most often, at least. Sarah, are you there?
I am here. Thank you. I was muted.
Oh, there you go.
Oh,
That
it
helps.
throws me off. All right. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for filling in. Yeah, Scott mentioned Dave is on vacation. We don't know where he went. We don't know when he'll be back, but we do know that he let us run this without him. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you all for joining us today, July 13th, 2022. As always, when we start these webinars, we like to do a bit of housekeeping. First, I'd like to just mention our webinar schedule. Next week, there will be an Alpha Anywhere feature deep dive on a couple of features that will be led by Dion McCormick. He's picked out a few things with this new release that he thinks are pretty cool and would like to give you guys a demo on. And then starting on the 27th of July, we'll start talking about building custom web themes. August 3rd, we'll be talking about debugging server-side scripts specifically. And then on August 10th, if we can't fit it all in one session, which I don't think I can, we will continue the discussion on custom web themes. As always, a reminder, Devcon is coming up October 18th to the 22nd. Be there. Register now. I'd love to see you there if you are a new user, been building with Alpha for a long time. We'd love to have you join us. And then finally, an announcement. I should have announced this last week. Alpha Anywhere support for Windows Server 2016 has ended. We have a support policy of once Microsoft servers reach end of life, or not servers, Microsoft's operating system reach end of life with Microsoft, we tend to support them at least 6 months after that. And then after that 6 month period is gone, we deprecate and no longer support installing or running or testing Alpha Anywhere on these platforms. And Windows Server 2016, unfortunately, as of the 1st of July, is no longer supported. If you are running on this server, we strongly encourage you update to 2019 or 2022. In fact, if you are going to update, you might as well make the jump to the latest you can get, because that will ensure that you can stay within our service window for as long as possible. And just as an idea of what that looks like, Windows Server 2022, our planned Alpha Anywhere support will end for that on July 1st in 2027, which is a ways out. So ending support for operating systems lets us keep current with the tools that we use to build Alpha Anywhere and to ensure that we're providing you with the best product that we can. And unfortunately, this needs to happen. Windows Server 2016, Microsoft stopped supporting that at the beginning of the year of this year. And we want to encourage you to make sure that you are updating, because staying on old stale operating systems that aren't updated or become vulnerable to security holes and that kind of stuff. So we recommend that you update. Also note, Windows 10 actually does have an end of life date now, because Windows 11 was released by Microsoft, so keep an eye on that. We're going to be supporting this for a long time, because it's not going to be out of mainstream support until 2025, but just keep in mind, always be updating, keeping your systems up to date. And today we're going to be talking about the new Alpha Anywhere release, which came out, was released at the beginning of the week, just in time for today's webinar. And so I was very grateful for that. We're not talking about this in the might be next week kind of thing. But the Alpha Anywhere 4.6.4.2 release has over 40 new features. And this presentation is just going to be like a high-level overview of what's in it. I'm not going to get to every single thing because there's only so much I can cover. And there's a few things I don't know if it's even worth mentioning, like IIS recycling, changing to ensure that your systems stay up without interruption. But some of the big stuff that you may not notice, or you may notice, things that might make your life easier as a developer, wanted to point those out today. So that big one, quality of life improvements, changes to the IDE to make it easier to build applications, or make it easier to find what you need to do. This is a big one. A search bar has been added. Anywhere you see a property grid, which is this layout of like 2 columns with a name and a value, that's a property grid. They're used everywhere throughout the product for you to configure things. And all of them now have this search bar at the top, regardless of how many properties are in them. So you can just search for something. There are places where we have property grids that are quite long. Web project properties is one that you may be familiar with that previously hasn't had any search options in there at all. So this is huge to figure out, where settings are and locating them quickly. And it's as simple as just clicking in that box, typing in what you're looking for, and this property grid will automatically filter to show you what you want. You select the field you want to work with. If you clear it out, it'll maintain that selection. But I think this is huge. Be aware that because this has been added, you may see some discrepancies between what is shown in documentation and what you actually see in the IDE, and that's just because we have a lot of pictures to go through and update to capture this little change in there. So just be aware that it works the same. So. Another thing that was added is live testing now supports running TLS SSL, so turning on SSL security in the development server is supported when doing a live test, and this was accomplished by automatically generating self-signed certificates that get installed and are recognized so that you can test things that might require, regardless of where you're running it, that you are in a secure environment. There's a new option in web project properties for validating email settings, setting up your email, SMTP server, username and password, SSL options. Sometimes that can be a bit tricky to configure if you're unsure how to do it or you're not confident that you're doing it. So this test settings option can be used to test that you've set those up properly. Jumping around a bit more in the Cordova builder, if you build using Cordova CLI or Ionic AppFlow, there's an option to open up the config XML file, which if you are building mobile apps and you run into problems, we may ask you to send us this file. But editing that file is also a way for you to add things that might be missing that you might need to manually add in. It's very rare needing to go in there and edit that. But there's a configure XML editor link on there now, which you can use to specify what tool to open for editing. So this screenshot just shows I've set it up to open VS Code, whatever XML editor you prefer, you can use. Otherwise, I do believe it'll just open whatever the default text editor is on your system. And then another thing that's been added, if you ever building in the UX control and you add multiple new controls at once, there's this big text box where you write first name, last name, so on and so forth. Each line is a control, and there's a syntax for defining extra properties about that control, like the data type or how wide it is. There's now an option to also define the label, which enables you to set the label text while also creating the control and save you a step later of trying to hunt that setting down and changing it. And that syntax is just open bracket, label name, close bracket. And you can always click this click syntax, click for syntax examples button link in this dialog when you're adding a new control to open up the help for what syntax you are allowed to use in this builder. The very simple help is up here. It's field name bar type. That's just the field, and the type is the data type. So C for character or D for date. But this is a new expansion of that simple markup language for defining controls, multiple at the same time. We've also added a new warning, which warnings are always not great. They always feel rather rude when they pop up, but this one's actually important. If you put a list control in a container that doesn't have a height and you tell it to fill the container, and we're not talking about a panel card, we're talking about like a container control, you may not see that list when you go to render your UX component because it doesn't have a height. And the purpose of this warning is to let you know that you've put your list in a container with no height and told it to fill the height, and it just doesn't know what to do with that. So you need to, at a minimum, give your container a vertical height. Keep in mind that you cannot use something like 100% on heights because unlike width, which is always going to be constrained to the width of the window that the device is using, like your monitor or your phone, Height can go on forever because stuff can scroll down the screen. So height has to be an explicit value. That's just keep that in mind. If you want something where the list fills both the width and the full height, you probably want to use a panel. So mobile, we've made some improvements for Android in particular. We've got new support for the Ionic build stack for Linux 2021.10, which is this column over here that we'd ran into. This happened a while ago in development. It was right after the last release. Someone let us know that this wasn't working, so we added that support. So if you need to build on Ionic app flow with the Linux 2021.10 build stack, that's in this release, as is support for Cordova CLI, the version that includes Cordova Android 10.1.1, which is required to build for API level 30, which is the minimum required, I believe, at this time for pushing apps into the Google Play Store. So that is included in this release. And we also added something, we added a property for specifying what version of Cordova CLI you're using on your machine. So it's going to be 11, 10, 9, or 8. And you're going to know that from what you installed off of the website for Cordova CLI. But in the builder now, there's a place to set that. And if you set that, it's going to set up a bunch of default settings for you, which you definitely want to set that, because there's, depending on what you're building on, you might need Android X. You might not. It might, so like Cordova 11 doesn't require the Android X enabled preference flag, but Cordova 10 and 9 do. And that was just a transition with the native libraries for Android and the Android X libraries moving forward, and the mapping between the two in that transition period that's needed. So make sure you're specifying which Cordova version you're using in that builder now, so that these can be set up for you automatically. Under 11, note that host scheme and name preference are required, as is Android insecure file mode enabled. Moving on to user interface stuff, and this is predominantly things you can add to your apps, changes in things like our PDF viewer control in the UX component, which has some new properties for compressing the PDF download before it's sent, or turning that off, as well as specifying the file name to use on the client when that's created, whether or not to show the toolbar. And then also an option on the JavaScript side of things to load the PDF from session variable using the PDF viewer load method. This is something you can put in your apps to add some new functionality. So we've got PDF viewer. We've got a few updates on the list control. For starters, I think this one is actually rather big. For a while, we've always been able to store images in mobile applications with a list. You've always been able to upload them to storage. That's always been supported when shipped on Cordova app. But if you're using the HTML5 image capture method, which is just the other method for browsing on your device or your computer and selecting the image, uploading it, that's never really supported uploading to storage. It's always required the server, and now storage is supported. So that will now upload to storage, and you don't have to do anything with a after file upload event to push that into your file storage service of choice. So this is going to be for web applications, or even mobile web applications, and at some point in the future, PWAs. There's also a new UI for building the column footer template. I think in the past this has just been a text box, but now it has the ability to specify a couple of rows and in custom HTML in each one of those rows, and whether or not you want to include data in the column footer. And then as separately, if you have lists built on a native SQL query, you can also define a SQL query to fetch the fields that are in that list. And the primary reason for doing that is if your query to populate takes a while and you don't specify a query to fetch the fields, the builder will use the same query to fetch the data and figure out what those fields are. If you customize the query, just get the field listing, it can be significantly faster depending on how much time it takes to fetch those records. So you may want to leverage this in your lists that use native queries to speed them up a bit on that initial load, or even while you're working with them in the designer to help improve some speed. We have new JavaScript controls, which you saw a bit last week in the demo. Was this last week? The demo on micro interactions, where we had that radio button, and when you hovered over it, it showed that highlighted border on hover. That was done using the JavaScript control option, which lets you do things like use SVG icons or images of your choice for the checkbox and radio buttons. It also exposes new JavaScript methods for those objects that can be used to repopulate choices at runtime, which is significantly easier than the way we used to let you do it, which is rather convoluted. It's just obj.populate now. So you build out your array of options, you call populate, same as if the drop-down, drop-down control, a list control. The simple list control has a similar option. We've also improved lookups for text boxes. You can now use something called a cascading lookup or a cascading list for the lookup. And what that lets you do is kind of build out this organized drop-down menu of choices. And then once you get to a leaf node, that's the value that gets populated into the control. But this is how this will look now when someone clicks this button, if that's what you want to provide. For for data lookups that might contain a lot of information, this might be a better way for you to group it into a two-stage picker instead of all one list. It could also replace grid components in places where you might be using them right now. We've also added another thing. It's menu bars, which are just that horizontal menu across any app that you see. It says like file, home, insert, draw. It's a horizontal menu, and menu bars are the same thing. It's a new UI layout for tree controls, so that's going to be available to you in both the tabbed UI and the UX component where you're using tree controls. You can also choose this layout option if you are using the menus action JavaScript as one of the layout options. And all it simply does is renders the objects in the tree control in this horizontal menu with drop down, and then submenus pop out to the side like any other menu that you may have experienced in an application. We've also added tabbed UI favorites, which are a way that your users can build a custom menu that contains the things that they're using most frequently in a tabbed UI. And I'm not going to show you what this looks like because that would spoil Deion's presentation next week. But this is a new feature added so that you can provide this a way for your users to put the things they're doing most in one place, as opposed to having to dig through the interface every time, which can add up in time savings in some cases. There's been a lot of reports, not of improvements to reports. If you've been on the forum, I've been on the forum. I know you guys are talking about reports. I've seen the emails coming in. We've made a lot of improvements to it. There isn't much mention of this in the release notes, but we've made a lot of fixes. We also added a HTML layout customization. So if you add something called PDF CSS to the web project folder, you can use that to style HTML and HTML layout control in your report. This was added because we updated the control and how it's styled by default changed. And so this is the easiest way that we've provided a way for you guys to get back to either how it looked before or customize it some other way. And then also rendering improvements. We fixed a lot of report layout issues and report generation. Please download this update, test your reports on them if you've been having issues. If you're still having issues, please tell us. But we've done a lot of work to improve it, and it's gotten a lot better. We've also made some changes in the security side of things. So this is going to be everything from open SSL down into auditing stuff or login changes in this section. And then first and foremost, OpenSSL put out some new updates. So we updated OpenSSL, and you'll want to get this because you always want to be running the latest version of OpenSSL to ensure you're not vulnerable to any known security vulnerabilities in the TLS SSL framework. We've also added some options in the UX component to customize some of the CORS headers And if you were here a couple weeks ago, we did a presentation on Chords. If you missed that, you can go watch it on YouTube. Also, like and subscribe while you're there so you get notifications when we post new content. But these options were added so that API calls can be made to a UX component, possibly hosted on an internal private network, and to also restrict what origins can communicate with that components in cases where you've got two applications that need to talk to each other, but they're not hosted on the same IP or the same domain. So that was added in. But we also added something called callback functions that are always allowed. I'm calling it Ajax callback whitelists. Essentially, this is only exposed if you have login, but what it lets you do is expose a few action JavaScript functions that can be called regardless of whether or not the user is logged in. And there are cases where you need to do that. Without whitelisting them, users can't, or not users, there are potentially some operations you can't do until the user actually verifies their login. So take a look at that. That's in the login settings in the UX component. You may or may not need to leverage that, but it's something to check out. We've also made some auditing improvements on the login process itself. If somebody uses the forget password link, you can now have a message logged in the repository table that action happened and that an email was sent to somebody. If this is a requirement for you, you might want to check that out. But we also added an Authentication Keys table, which this is used with OAuth authentication, and what it basically does is it stores tokens so that they can be looked up at later, possibly refreshed if refresh tokens are used, without you needing to keep track of all of these things in memory. And there's a XBasic method that comes with this. These are used with the named providers. So, the file download action JavaScript, we tightened up security on that. I'm not going to go into details of the vulnerability, but someone kindly pointed something out and we fixed that up. So that is now much more secure. And then also Google Authenticator now has an option to provide a unique secret per user. If you were using this, I would encourage you to update your app and turn that on and republish your app so that people can use a per user secret. And then finally, we have server-side scripting. These are things that are new in XBasic specifically. All of the HTTP functions have been updated. They now use TLS 1.2. By default, the application server, classic server, as well as IIS no longer communicate over HTTP 1. That's been removed from the configuration, and as part of moving forward and removing that support and basically providing better, more secure communications, we've updated all these functions to use TLS 1.2. Now, if you're working with a service that doesn't support TLS 1.2, and does require 1.1, you can use HTTP fetch to change that protocol to use the 1.1 version. But you are going to have to go through and replace those places where you're using get or post with fetch instead. Just something to be aware of if you're using these lower level XBasic functions to do API calls to web services. We also added a bunch of functions for self-signed certificates for generating and installing a self-signed certificate on the machine. This is a list of them. FDQN is something about the machine name. Generally, I don't think any of you will need to use these, but it's something that we added as in support for adding that live test support for running HTTPS in live test instead of HTTP on the development server. So this is a thing you might want to, maybe you're interested in it, you can check it out. And then finally, that auth tokens, retrieving auth tokens from the authentication table, the authentication keys table, which does need to set up in web project properties. There's a XBasic function that goes with all of that, and that's this A5 get auth tokens from auth table function. And what it simply does is retrieve a token from the authentication table, and if it's got a refresh token and the token's expired, it tries to get a new one for you. And if you want to learn more about and all the nitty-gritty detail of all those things right there, you can go to the release notes, and I will put this in the chat for you guys. Boop, there we go. So that's available for you. But I do want to, open it up for questions now, questions on features here, or even if we don't have much about, new feature questions, we can certainly talk about a few questions that came into guides this week that I could also answer. Or some interesting questions that I feel like might be worth giving some attention to.
Yeah, well, we do have a few questions. I think one in particular that is came in during the presentation was like, how do you do the refresh token?
It's handled in the setting up refresh tokens. It's something you set up with the authentication provider when you configure that. There's an option to say, hey, this has refresh tokens, and tell it what those are, and those are mapped to a specific column in the table. But that function will try to fetch those refresh tokens, use those refresh tokens to get you a new token if it determines that it can do that.
Okay. Another one, is there a guide or somewhere I can look to move my application from HTTP to HTTPS? Do I need to purchase a security certificate?
So depending on the server you're running on, you simply just need to turn it on. And then yes, you will need to get a certificate. We did a webinar on this a while back recently. It focused on Alpha Cloud, but it's the same, or more or less the same thing in terms of getting a certificate. You go to sslcerts.com or SSLS.
Yeah, and when you were talking,
certificate, yeah, you will need a certificate, an SSL certificate.
When you were talking about updating servers because of changes in Windows Server supports, a question did come in at that time about Alpha Cloud. What is it currently operating on?
I'm not sure what Alpha Cloud is currently operating on, but that operating system support thing doesn't apply to Alpha Cloud, nor does it apply to Alpha Transform, because Alpha Cloud, we host it for you. And I would assume at this point we've migrated forward, but I would have to ask.
Yeah. All right. Well, for right now, those are the questions we have currently. You were mentioning that there were a lot of talk about reports in the forum, and then you also mentioned other questions that have come up this week. What do you have in mind?
So it actually pertains to let's launch the Alpha Anywhere here. The installer. Oh, I already got it running. So we had someone write in asking about web services, and they built their own web service. And let's see here. Let's open up sample here. And let's edit this action get accounts and take a look at it. That's a header. Pet store. I'm in the wrong place. All right. So this is the UI for building a REST API that serves up data you want to serve. And this one was one that we did a while ago, and it was built off of the Northwinds database. We have a SQL genie that will generate this for you. And the question we got from someone was they were getting a 404 error, and they were like, I'm passing in data on an argument, and if I pass in less than X characters, it works, and if I go beyond that limit, it doesn't work. And the issue was that what was happening was they were actually passing in all the data they wanted to post as a query string parameter. And the problem with that is that query strings, that's the URL in the URL bar that you type in, those are limited on most browsers to about 1024 characters. Some might go up to twice that. But that, even though there's no actual like limit in the specification for that URL bar, it is limited by most browsers, and they were attempting to pass in all the data they wanted to post using that query string and hitting that limit, and it was causing problems. And the way you need to approach that, and this is really true of any time you want to post something, is put all your data in the body and not in the query string. For starters, putting stuff in the query string is going to be visible to anybody that sees that traffic go through. But second is that you are also going to hit that limit if you want to post like a lot of records or a large amount of data. So the best way to go about it to post that data is actually use the body of your post action. So that's done. In here, this is configured. It's set up to, it does a REST verb of post, and it says here, arguments are passed into the body. You can also say query string, but body, and then you have two options here, JSON or form encoded. I would recommend choosing JSON because by and large, that's the method almost everyone uses in the REST service API universe. JSON is very popular, and so a lot of people are going to know what that is. Form encoded is just like a name value pair with the equal sign assigning the value to the field name. Both are good choices. I prefer JSON. But that's how you set it up here in this method when you're exposing it. In the actual implementation of this, if we go and we look at the class, let us not save that. So customer service or customer demo A5 SVC has an XBasic class implementation here. We'll just go find customers, post. I think it's the select takes a post. And then we do select generic, customers, select generic. That's schema generic. Here we go. So I just want to see if I can figure it out here. That's adding a header. I need to go back up. Trying to think about how we did this. Anyway, that body information is going to come in, and it's going to get mapped to, I think it gets mapped to properties passed into your function. Open this guy back up. Method arguments. Yes. So here are the arguments, and those arguments are sent in the body. So the body is going to have a JSON object. One of the values in that JSON object is fields, and it's going to have that string value. Where is going to have the string value, order. These are each properties in that JSON object. And that gets passed in to the method for you. See here. Arguments are listed here. If you click on how to define the arguments description, it's specified as comments in the function itself that you add here. All of these functions are actually read out of the class, which is why they're here automatically. And that comment, see here, let's not save that. Go back to that implementation. So those arguments, so it says it has this format, argument field. So it's an argument to your method. Its name is field, and then everything after that colon is the description of what it does or what it is. And then up here you can see that's those values are passed in as individual arguments to that function. So that's how the body arguments come in. I know it's a little bit hairy to wrap your brain around, but if you generate one of those if you come in here and you just right click in the XBasic editor and you use Genie, there's let me see here. I feel like I'm staring right at it. Curl command XBasic.
We did
Oh,
actually
you know,
have
it's not a Genie. I'm sorry. I'm confusing myself. It's actually, if you go through new web service. I'm not seeing it. I think I have to select it. New. Create a new definition to create a REST service. And then use the Genie to create a REST service to expose database tables. You go through this, and then you can, pick something like Northwind, something simple. Just one of the tables. And then just pick everything here, just to see how that's all handled as a REST API that passes in data through the body. That's the thing I want to talk about just real briefly.
we did have a question related to genies
Mm-hmm.
and query strings, but specifically a URL query string. How do you build a URL query string in Alpha? And are there any genies that can help us pick or choose fields and build it, test it, etc.?
On the JavaScript side of things, yes, we have a function that will do that. Let me pull up the doc on that. So if you're building query strings with JavaScript, we have something called the A5 Ajax build URL parameter function, and what this takes is a parameter, which is the name of that query string variable, and the value, so what it should equal. And you can use this to build up an array. This is how we show it in the example, but you just push a bunch into an array and then join them all together with an ampersand, because that's how you combine multiples. On the basic side of things, I am not 100% sure if we have something. The basic format of URI encode, I think. Oops. The big thing about query strings is that they need to be URL or URI encoded. So trying to remember what we called that one. URL encode. There we go. There's a function called URL encode that will escape everything that needs to be escaped in that string. You will definitely want to encode the value and the name of that query parameter, but building that up, you may need to just do it manually. So this does have a little example of how that could be done. There are a bunch of different ways to do this. Is there a best way? Possibly, but I would need to research a little bit more to figure out what the best way to go about that with XBasic beyond using this function.
Yeah, they also followed it up with or a GraphQL builder.
We do have a GraphQL builder. That is something we made a lot of improvements to. I didn't talk about it today because it's on my backlog of things to get to with documentation. But we did a whole bunch of improvements on GraphQL in this release. GraphQL is I believe it's a language for describing a service. It uses JSON. And there were a whole bunch of improvements made to it. The GraphQL service builder, you might have seen it when we were going through this add a web service. So if we do new create service from a GraphQL service, and then you got to enter in that definition here. But we've got a bunch of new options down here for picking the connection string you're going to use, which tables you want to include in that. So like customer orders and order details are ones we use a lot. So this is building out that query string. Do you need authorization? Does it have authorization? If it does, how do you want to implement that? Do you want to use XBasic? Do you want to call a node module to do that? Is it passed in on the query string, or is it passed in on the header? Probably prefer to pass on the header, just because that's not in the URL. But that's you can set that up there. User-defined mutations, which mutations are like you can think of it as like a query. So if you have some that you want to add, you can add them here. Runtime error settings, default settings. What happens if there are errors on the validation if somebody submits something. So you can go through here and build all this up. It'll generate that service for you. I do want to just do a separate webinar on this at some point in the future, because this interface is always going to look like this code markup. I do consider this to be something that's going to be more intermediate advanced. But this is for building a GraphQL service that you're going to provide. There is also no, I think it's just building. I don't know why, but I'm confusing this with Swagger. Swagger is a markup for defining a service that you can use to import a service definition from somewhere else to build some XBasic to make it easier to call them.
Okay, we also had a couple of more user interface type questions that came in. And one you might be covering in a future webinar, it seems like, but is there a video that shows how to alter themes using the web style designer?
There's a lot of videos out there that have a lot of webinars, at least, that shows how to edit a theme with the style builder. You're going to start by opening it under the More menu. And then if you don't have one, you could copy one of the system defaults here. So we could go alpha blue and then make a local copy. I'm going to call it alpha blue copy. I'm going to detach this from its parent style because I know this is a inherited theme, which means it uses alpha and then changes a few things. If you don't check that box, you're just going to get the few changes. If you do check that box, it merges it all into one theme that you can work with. But as far as the web theme builder is concerned, it's broken into parts. You have an adjust tab where you can just change some of the exposed Sass variables, which will make changes throughout the entire app or through the entire theme. That's what you see here. These are readily accessible too from the UX component. And it's gonna, change all this stuff here. So, if we want to go a different route on blue, we pick a more purpley one, right? And then same here, we'll copy that guy. Just go in here and edit this real quick. And then maybe go a bit lighter on that guy. So you see how that updated that text there? And then see how dark these are? That's reading that header background color. The alternate accent color is being read into these properties. And this shows everything that you can style. Menu Marvase, that's potentially this guy. It might also be hard-coded, which would not be great. Nope, it's this definitely alternate accent. So, that updates your menu. You can see these things. If you go to the code, it's going to show you everything broken out in the map on the right there, which is the big parts of the layout. And then if you go into individuals like list, then you get into the sub-themes. Everything has a base, but you can, you know, add others if you want variations to use in your app. And as far as editing things, the classes, you know, these parts here, they all map to specific variables over here. So, and then eventually you have to go find that, you know, dot list here. I wonder if I can do, there we go. You can get into the, you know, list items selected, you know, get into editing the CSS and that kind of stuff. We are going to talk about web themes in August, so that's coming up soon.
Yeah, for sure. There's also a question about the view box, and you know, sort of an interesting one. But how do you determine the width of a view box if the fill control checkbox is selected? Well, I mean, you're telling it to fill the control, so I guess it depends on if there's a parent container holding that view box, and you can adjust if that's set to maximum. I don't know, maybe you can
If
answer
it's at runtime, you can use get pointer to get to HTML element of the view box and then just check its width property.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All
I guess
right.
style.width or something like that.
We definitely have some people interested in GraphQL webinar.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be maybe a good one for the future for sure.
If you are interested in GraphQL and you use GraphQL, or you want to know more about GraphQL, now is a great time to get in there and start using some of those new GraphQL features and provide us some feedback. I don't know that we have very many people using it. I know of a few, but that getting there and playing around with it would be something that would be worthwhile.
And there's some initial documentation there in the release notes that you link to.
Yeah. There is, yeah, it's new. The just big, huge, massive bucket of salt. I haven't updated the actual doc in the Alpha Anywhere help yet because I'm wearing too many hats now. But I apologize for that. It's gonna radically change. The doc tells you can do things in documentation.alphasoftware.com that doesn't line up with what the UI is now. So it's gonna change. We need to do a little bit more work there. There's gonna be a lot more information added than what's in the release notes as well.
Cool.
But yeah, I will try to get to that as quickly as possible. You know, GraphQL, if you guys want to do a webinar on that, that would be great. If you are a GraphQL expert and you would like to do a webinar on GraphQL, I would also love to have some guest presenters because you guys have been hearing a lot from me and a little bit from Dion. And I think one time Selwyn even did a demo. But I would like to get some of your voices in here as well, just to, you know, share the wealth of knowledge and expose some new ideas that maybe we haven't thought about.
Absolutely. I had one more question regarding the themes that you're working with there. Can you mix these themes? I'm not sure exactly what this is referring to. But can you mix these themes on different UXs?
No, you cannot mix you cannot mix the alpha-based web themes together into one UX. And the reason for that is because they use all the same class names. So something that changed, and this really only applies to people who've been around since version 11 and older. Back then we had just CSS themes, and the CSS classes used in those themes were unique to each theme. The theme name was actually embedded into the CSS class names, which did let you do something like mix a green and a blue theme together on two different components on the same page. But Alpha uses all the same class names with different implementations of those CSS classes. So, you know, if you're using Alpha or Alpha Blue or, you know, Alpha Green copy, even if you copy it, you know, the class name on base here, class name list, that's going to be identical between those two. And you know, while the colors on the adjust tab look different, these Sass variable names are going to be identical between them. So what's going to happen if you try to load two of those at the same time is whichever one you loaded second or last is going to win the CSS war, and everything's going to look like that. If you want to mix them together, one way you can get around that is to use iframes. I'm not a huge fan of that. A better way to go about it, and it's a little bit of work on your part, is to go in and actually, you know, duplicate the CSS and wrap it inside of some, bigger class name, which you can do quite easily with Sass, because Sass lets you do this kind of markup here. So we've got list item selected not, it's got a curly brace here, and then we have .edit. This is nested inside of here. So this isn't valid CSS, but it's valid Sass, and it will generate something that works on the web page. But you could do something like this to wrap up those two different looks if you want to have two different looks on your forms, on your apps from two different themes.
Great. Yeah, that seems to be it for current questions. If anybody else wants to jump one in before we finish up, that would be great. But yeah, we're running low on questions now.
Yeah, lots of questions of GraphQL. I will have to make a note that we could talk about that. Go and check out our YouTube channel for some of our past videos on styling or branding or web themes if you're interested in trying to learn more about that. And then I don't know if there's much else anybody wants to know about. If there's no other questions, we can wrap it up here, and you guys can come back next week for a deep dive on some of the new features and some tips and tricks that Dion's got for you guys. I will not be here next week, so it'll just be Scott and Dion.
Yep.
So I hope you guys have a ton of fun there.
Yeah, hopefully we will have some fun. So it'll be entertaining.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
So again, if you got any questions after this webinar, if you're watching it on YouTube, send your questions to guys@alphasoftware.com or post them on the forum, forum.alphasoftware.com. We are there, we are watching, and we do like to help where we can. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. We'll see you next week. All right, thanks. Bye-bye all.